Welcome to Byju's classes. We are back again with another edition of our weekly review of international events, and this time this curated special program for the aspirants for competitive examinations is of greater interest than usual because lots of development have been taking place all over the globe which are likely to have an impact on international relations not only in next few weeks but for years to come. We hope you will find it of use and of interest. The event which was causing the greatest apprehension and concern in the past week was eruption of violence and military hostilities between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now these two are almost insignificant in international relations normally, almost forgotten entities, but suddenly this seems to be, some analysts went to the extent of suggesting it might be the spark which might ignite the Third World War. Now that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but let's see what's been happening. These two republics were at one stage part of the Union of Soviet Republics, and throughout the period of USSR, these people lived in more or less peaceful coexistence. The story goes back a little. We have to turn the pages of history to understand the import of this conflict. Both of them were parts of the Tsarist Empire, but Stalin gave them independence in 1920, and after the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, a disintegration of Soviet Union, they became independent republics only in 1990s. But ever since there has been this rivalry, these tensions between these two republics, and the reasons for that are very easy to see. Armenia is populated by Christians and Azerbaijan is a predominantly Muslim country. Now it is not only a conflict between Christians and Muslims that were parts of Soviet Union once. I think there are more interesting issues involved in this. If you look at the Armenians claim that they have been victims of Muslim persecution for past hundreds of years. There is a small Armenian community which stays in India. They came to India as refugees avoiding persecution at the hands of the Muslim invaders way back 400-500 years. And they say that they have been victims of genocide in past centuries as well. There is a street in Calcutta named Armenian Street. This reminds us of our old connections with them. Interestingly, the Azerbaijanis are Islamic and they have close affinities with other Islamic nations in the neighborhood. Turkey, they feel an affinity with the southern Caucasian countries like Chechnya and Dagestan, which are parts of Soviet Union. They were parts of Soviet Union. They are now parts of Russia even today. And Russia has been facing a problem of Islamic terror from this part of its territories. But that again is not only the Russian connection. If you look at the map, the geopolitical dimension of the conflict is pretty complex and interesting. If you look at the map, Armenia is sandwiched between Azerbaijan and Turkey. It doesn't share a direct border with present-day Russia. It shares a border with Georgia, and Georgia of course is very close to Russia at the moment. That was the place where Stalin came from. But Azerbaijan, on the contrary, shares a border with Southern Caucasus and Russia. Additional problems are that the oil and gas resources which Russia commands and which provide energy to Europe pass through Dagestan. So this place is of great importance in context of European energy security. Issue of conflict at the moment is an enclave called Nagorno-Karabakh. This is an island which is populated entirely by Armenians, Christians, which are in the heart of Azerbaijan. Now this also is a bit of a trickery or a skullduggery which you might say which Stalin did. He was not of course a Christian, he was an atheist, he was a communist, but he wanted to control these republics entangled amongst themselves so they would not have any rebellious insurgent note against the regime in Moscow. So what happened was that this enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh is placed inside Azerbaijan, surrounded on all sides by Azerbaijanis Islamic population, but a small link, even narrower than a chicken's neck, linking it to Armenia, which allows Armenians, after the decline of the Soviet Union, after the disintegration of the Russian Empire, helping out fellow Christians in this enclave in Armenia. Now, in majority of nations recognize Nagorno-Karabakh as territory owned under sovereign control of Azerbaijan. But effectively for past 3 decades and more, it has been an autonomous unit, and it has been ruled by Armenians who have been supported by Armenia next door. Now, there was a conflict which broke out in 1916, which is referred to as a 4 Days War, but it was controlled, and ironically then the peacekeeping was done with the good officers of Belarus and Minsk, and Russia and France and Turkey got together, including Belarus, to say that these two republics should settle their differences diplomatically and peacefully. Interestingly, at the moment there is no such possibility, because Turkey, first of all, is displaying ambitions of restoring the state to old glory of the Byzantine Empire, the days of the Caliphate, and it is confronting the forces of European nations as well as Russia from northwestern tip in Libya to eastern Mediterranean, and everywhere they are pushing back what they think was their normal natural sphere of influence, wherefrom they have been pushed back. Now, there are other interesting aspects to this. Russia under Putin has had a security treaty with Armenians. If Armenia is attacked, they are supposed to come to the assistance of the Armenians. But the irony of ironies is that the Russia is exporting almost close to $1 billion worth of arms to Azerbaijan. So at the moment, the Azerbaijanis, who are trying to reclaim as much of the Nagorno-Karabakh as they can and reassert their control, annex it to their territory, cut off the supply lines to Armenia, are using Russian weapons and armaments, drones and weaponry, and also a bit of them coming from Israel. Turkey, of course, has been supplying them their drones and missiles, which it develops on its own. So there is this very uneasy balance, the tightrope which Putin's Russia has to walk. But if Putin stands and watches just and allows Azerbaijanis to take control of Nagorno-Karabakh, I think he is going to suffer a loss of face. His credibility would lose almost everywhere in the globe, and sooner or later he will have to either put pressure on Turkey to pull back or have a negotiated peace here. Now, what does it mean for India? It has very interesting, grave implications for India, because all the Muslim countries seem to have united in favor of fraternal Azerbaijanis. The Turks and the Pakistanis, of course, unabashedly say that they are our brothers, they are our Islamic brothers, we'll help them, and of course, when Islam is threatened, we'll come to their support. There is no such pushback in favor of Armenians from the Christian countries, but let's not forget that Putin in his recent constitutional amendments has said that Christianity is a core value of Russian civilization. So in this conflict of civilizations, this clash of civilizations, Islam versus Christianity, where Turkey and Russia has had an uneasy peace in Syria and elsewhere, it might not continue this happens. But this rallying together of all the Islamic nations has problems for India, because it seems to overlook the Shia-Sunni divide. Iran is on the same side as Saudi Arabia in this conflict, and all nations have said that they would support. Pakistan, of course, is unabashedly in the lap of China. So China, Pakistan, Turkey on one side. How long will this coalition last is again very interesting question, because Turkey has been criticizing China for genocide of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. So how long can this opportunistic alliance last in this Armenia, Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict? We'll have to wait and see. Another complication of this conflict is what is called CPT, China, Pakistan, Turkey axis, which seems to be working against the interests of India in this region. At the same time, Indians cannot remain indifferent that this territory, this zone of conflict is very close to unstable Afghanistan. Peace has not returned even after the peace talks with Taliban. Pakistan remains a key actor there, and if mercenaries come to Azerbaijan, it is difficult to imagine that they will remain confined to Azerbaijan or to work in Armenia. Even if the peace comes to this zone, it is very difficult to understand that the Armenians will give up. There might be partisan guerrilla warfare, and this might destabilize this whole region, threatening the energy security of West Europe, having impact on the image of Russia as a major power which can't control events and disturbances right in its backyard. Putin will be wary of directly interfering there after Crimea and Ukraine, but the problems remain. If he doesn't take decisive action here, it might have a snowballing, cascading effect somewhere else. But India has primarily to worry about its own interests, so India probably has only to wait and watch and have a diplomatic response, but watch very, very carefully what is happening. When the attention of the world was focused on this dangerous conflict, a new emerging flashpoint in Central Asia, bordering on Middle East and West Asia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, there were developments in far off Pacific concerning very, very small countries and territories which remained neglected most of the time. But right now, I think what is the potential of conflict there is also pretty dangerous. Now what happens is that what is called the Pacific Forum, which has 17, 18 countries and territories, or you have the Southwest Pacific region, you only think of one or two big countries, big in the context of this region, because most countries there are microscopic atolls, mini micro states, which have a population, some have a population of 1,500, 1,600, some have a population like Nauru of 10,000. The largest of them, of course, Papua and New Guinea, has a population larger than New Zealand's, but that is besides the point. They again are so dependent on Australia, New Zealand and other big powers that we tend to overlook them. And we tend to overlook the special connection which India had with a pretty significant country in this region like Fiji, where we have lost ground steadily over the past few years, but that is another story. Right now what we are worried about is that whenever one is talking of China's expansive, aggressive drive in South China Sea, North Japan Sea and eastern part of the Chinese Sea, we tend to overlook what is happening in the Pacific Rim. The Indians are very happy to say that the next century is the Indo-Pacific era. So we are happy because the name Indo is joined with Pacific, but we don't see that what our capabilities are, what our presence is. Shinzo Abe had proposed an alliance, not a military alliance, but a formation of 4 countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia and India, which would be active in this region in Pacific and probably act as a countervailing force to China here. Everybody responded very nicely. There are some joint exercises. There's only sometime meeting of foreign ministers in Tokyo to give concrete shape to this. But unfortunately, what remains neglected is that this microstates in Pacific, what is happening there? Now, interestingly, there are 2 or 3 interesting developments which took place. When the Chinese ambassador went to Kiribati, and we have discussed this before in this program, the tribals welcomed him by lying prostrate on the ground, and he walked over them, and it was said, oh look, this is what the Chinese have a racist policy towards these countries. But the indigenous people said that this is our custom and nobody else should decide what our custom is. Now, Kiribati, Nauru, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Marshall Islands, you will have difficulty finding them even on a very large scale map. They are pinpoints. But the interesting part is this, that they are strategically very, very important. 2 interesting things which we must mention and bring to your notice. If you have these dots and mark them in red color, which are the ones which recognize Beijing and People's Republic of China, and mark in black or blue those who recognize Taiwan, we would notice that in the past couple of years, many of them have changed their loyalties from Taiwan to China. What does it mean? It means some very interesting things, but we'll come to that in a moment. Let's talk about territories. We talk about autonomous territories, which suddenly have become important. And when we say autonomous territories, they are incongruities. They are actually vestiges of colonialism. You have, say for instance, New Caledonia, which is a French territory. And the French seem to dictate its foreign policy, dictates its diplomatic policies. For purposes, for international law, it might be an independent entity, but actually it is not. France exercises control over it. Now similarly, if you go to Papua and New Guinea, interestingly, the eastern part of Papua New Guinea, which is called Irian Barat, is part of Indonesian territory, and the western part is an independent country, but it also has aspirations of being reunited with what is the Indonesian territory, and people feel that this kind of disaffection is spread by countries which have traditionally controlled the natural resources and have exercised influence in their foreign defense policies, say for instance Australia. If you look at the map of Australia, the northern territory of Darwin is very close to Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. So that is one part. Now similarly, if you take a small territory like Niue, you will find out it is not an independent country, it is mentioned as a territory, and France pays out every year euros 1.5 billion to this to maintain is almost all of their budget. Interestingly, this is a country which produces nickel, and the largest purchaser of nickel from this territory, Niue, is China. And the Chinese nickel imports give an earning of again close to euros 1.1 billion every year. There is this tussle that who is trying to give more aid to one of these smaller countries, pampering its leaders which are autocrats, giving them infrastructural aid or promises of infrastructural aid. And mostly people thought that these countries did not matter because they had very small population, and the joke at one stage was that Nauru was only exporting phosphate and the export earnings were being spent on importing soil and retaining that the island remain intact. There is only one runway, there is only one highway, and the total population is 10,000. Now, right now there are some conflicts. Like in New Caledonia, there was an arrangement with France that every 2 years for the next 6-year period, there would be a referendum whether New Caledonia wanted to remain a part of France as a autonomous territory under French jurisdiction, or it would like to become an independent country. Last time when the referendum took place, 56-57% people decided against separation. But situation is changing very fast. So some people say it's changing because China is trying to win over the leaders of these countries by bribes or money or promises. But then again you think of some other idea. This is the area where the US controlled Guam is there, where the major base is there, which is what North Korea threatens often enough, that is within the reach of its nuclear missiles and weaponry and so on. But the most interesting part is that these might be very small microscopic countries, federated states of Micronesia for instance. But if you apply the laws of seas, and if they become independent countries, and if they draw lines of territorial waters, and if they draw lines of exclusive economic zone, this would be a whole area. If China has naval bases, China has favorable regimes, that the kind of conflicts which we are witnessing in South China Sea, the kind of conflicts which are emerging in Eastern Mediterranean would also be there in Southwest Pacific and in this area. Now, Indians were transported as indentured labor in large numbers to Fiji during the British colonial rule. They were at one stage close to 40-45% of the total population, but then there was a systematic campaign to have an anti-Indian sentiment, as they were the dominating racial group there, ethnic group there, and the indigenous people were suffering. So the backlash against Indians was so strong, the diasporic connection was lost, and an ambassador at one stage was declared persona non grata and asked to return. Now, we have never regained that ground in Fiji, but the problem is that have we devoted attention to the colonial powers erstwhile? There is a British territory in this region. There's an American Samoa which now has become Samoa itself. So we, people who are ethnographers, people who are cultural anthropologists, have an interest of coming of age in Samoa. Or they will say, oh, tribal customs, or the 6 feet 6 inches tall president of King of Tonga. Now, these are countries which can be very easily manipulated by an external power. And let's not only talk of China. It could be a European power like France, it could be an America, it could be United States of America, it could be residual, something like the Falkland presence for the ego of Great Britain, UK in this region. But what is most important is, let us not forget that so far these territories, due to proximity, have been dominated and controlled by Australians and New Zealanders. And there are rich resources, mineral, forest, timber, which logically is most easily exploited by any government in these territories with cooperation and partnership with Australia and New Zealand. But isn't that a continuation of neocolonialism in another manner, which is what China can argue about. China can provoke the leadership. If there is a ruling party doesn't support China, China can go to the opposition party. And the witness this in the latest annual convention of the UN General Assembly, when the ambassador of Vanuatu, the spokesperson, criticized Indonesia for human rights violations in Irian Barat, in its part of Eastern Timor. And Indonesians reacted with very great strength and anguish and anger and said Vanuatu should mind its own business. It should leave Indonesia alone. Now, interestingly, Indonesia is part of Southeast Asia and a member of the ASEAN state. But its territories in eastern Papua and New Guinea, Irian Barat, reach almost to the Pacific tip. So there is a relationship which has to be managed between Indonesia, New Zealand and Australia and New Zealand with their erstwhile colonial possessions, and an external power like France or Britain after the era of colonialism trying to assert that they have a strategic or an economic interest in this region. Now, this is something which we have to keep in mind when we are talking of the Pacific Rim, we are talking of the Quad, because sooner or later India will have to confront these challenges. Problems relating to Brexit never seem to end. Partly they are due to the stubbornness of Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, but he also says that the EU is trying to be very, very rigid about having a post-Brexit arrangement with Britain. He has not helped matters at all. He has signed an agreement with the United States of America. He keeps saying that what is wrong if Britain moves out of European Union, because European Union, whether it is one currency, whether it is transit barrier-free travel, has been impinging on the sovereignty of United Kingdom. So on one hand, there is an issue of sovereignty of Britain, and of course, he doesn't go into the part where Britain has not made reasonable contributions to the... It never was a part of this currency union. It also had a different visa. So the problem is that grievances which Britain is putting forward at the moment are really ex post facto grievances which it is putting forward. As long as it was flourishing with EU, it had no problems. There were two issues of the Irish backstop and the fisheries. And now Boris Johnson is trying to buy time, bluff his way around, gamble for higher stakes, and say that ultimately EU will blink and there will be some kind of a more favourable trade arrangement post-Brexit for UK. But this does not seem to be working out, because the Irish backstop remains a complicated issue. The difference in interests of Britain and interests of Scotland and Wales remain there very much. So he came out with a elaborate set of proposals which Brussels turned it down and said that it was a repetition. But then he made a few gestures in recent past saying that there may be a compromise about fisheries. But the fisheries problem was hardly resolved, that a new issue has cropped up which is very difficult, which is the state subsidy to industries. Now this is interesting because the European Union consistently argues that there should be a level playing field for all members of the European Union. No government should give subsidies or state support to its industries. Now Britain's argument is very interesting. It says that it supports its farmers, its dairy and its high-tech industries, but the subsidies amount to much less. They are almost half the subsidies which French give to their farmers, French give to their wine growers, and the Germans give to their agricultural sector or their high-tech industries. Or the US does it. Now this is an extremely interesting issue, because in the post-COVID world, when the global economy is in great and grave recession, can there be an economic revival, regeneration of jobs and livelihood, unless there is a state subsidy given to certain core industries? Now that's where the argument becomes a little more complicated, and it is worth pursuing this in some detail, because we in India are going to face the same kind of arguments. How much of state subsidy can the sick industries expect? How much can the government do? And whether it would immediately invoke sanctions against you in an international trade system is against state subsidies. Now, the arguments are twofold. Now, the Nobel Prize winning economist Stiglitz has come out openly that the regulation of international trade dates back to legal arrangements which were incorporated in 1990s, and they already are 3 decades old, and they do not reflect the reality of the present day world order. It also says that ever since 2008, crisis, financial crisis, states have intervened to revive economies, and you can't go back on that. We also have to keep in mind, when the European Union comes out with a scheme for supporting Greece or Portugal or Spain, it is an example of state intervention. Now, there is also an extremely interesting argument which Stiglitz puts forward. He says that if a country comes out with a package to revive its financial banking system, and the banks in turn decides to choose to lend to certain sectors of the economy, that's an indirect state subsidy to that sector. But most interesting is, Stiglitz also admits that the United States may be having a disguised system of subsidies where the Defense Department funds research in high-tech weaponry and aircraft and missile and rocketry, or NASA, and they have research projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, which are handed over to industries working in these high-tech, strategically sensitive areas, which are state subsidies. It also says a similar kind of thing might be having to pharmaceutical industry through the National Health Institute. So this is a candid admission. But the interesting part is this, that the most powerful advisor, Dominic Cummings, to Boris Johnson, has the same argument. He says that we should follow partly only what Margaret Thatcher said. Margaret Thatcher had once famously said that industries should not expect the government to support them and save them. Either they swim or they sink. It is the survival of the fittest. Now, Dominic Cummings, who is the most important advisor for Boris Johnson at the moment, says that this is only partly true. When the Leyland motor industry was heading for bankruptcy, it had been pumped in almost £1 billion sterling over a 7-8 year period, but it could not be revived. Now, Dominic Cummings has an argument that the future is going to belong to high-tech industries which have a very long gestation period and which have a high risk of failure, and if Britain is to remain a major power in international relations and a major economy, it will have to support these sunrise industries. So he is betting very heavily on these industries. Now, this is something which is going to complicate the Brexit negotiations even more. These offers will go back and forth. By the middle of the month of October, we would have some clarity whether, because after that there is no time. If the middle of October is gone and there is no agreement, then Britain will have to get out of European Union without an agreement, and whatever mess it leaves behind, not only Britain, Europe and the rest of the world will have to cope with. But this latest complication about state subsidies is interesting because it affects not only Britain and EU, it affects the relationships between countries within European Union and the rest of the world and the system of international trade, which is already under great stress. President Macron of France has this tendency to get into a controversy the moment he makes a speech. It happened last week. He came out with a very hard-hitting speech which some of his countrymen had been waiting for. He said Islam is globally in a state of crisis. And because Islam is in crisis, it is adopting a confrontationist posture. He did not name Turkey, but obviously Turkey, Iran, and the promotion of Wahhabi Islam from Saudi Arabia all come in one category. So this was a statement which is being taken by some people as promoting Islamophobia, and unfortunately it comes at a time which is not very opportune, because the French president recently had toured Lebanon after a very destructive explosion there and made an offer to make massive contributions for reconstructions and rehabilitation of Beirut in Lebanon. But he had a condition, that the government in Lebanon should change, it should not be corrupt, it should be responsible, it should be transparent, and obviously it was France who was going to decide whether a particular government, a particular ruling elite was transparent, responsible and efficient. At that moment when people were suffering, some people had also requested loudly on camera they would much rather have the France come back and restore the things to propriety in Lebanon and Beirut. But now in this, when we draw towards the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, nobody can believe that an erstwhile colonial power can come and take over the responsibility of restoring order, exterminating corruption, and restoring economy in a strife-torn country, where there also is a very strong element of religious strife between Christians and Muslims. Macron has stepped in like that in northwestern African territories, in Libya. He has been very active in peacekeeping outside the United Nations things. The French Foreign Legion has been active in Sahel countries, in the northwestern tip of African countries, where again the confrontation is between Islamic jihadis and the French troops, Foreign Legion, which may have some Islamic recruits, but which has no religious complexion, but more or less fighting almost like mercenaries under a national command for a better future, getting out of a conviction, and so on and so forth. Now, these issues have come up recently, as we discussed earlier, and if there is a referendum about France's control in New Caledonia and Pacific, people are suddenly reminded that, oh, France has a colonial position there as well. So this tendency of the French president to assert the dynamism of French foreign policy and its determination to maintain secularism. To be fair to Macron, it must be said that he's even-handed in implementing the Napoleon Code. Napoleon was the first person who decided that the state and religion should be separated in the French Republic. He established an empire, but this separation continued. So he has said that even Roman Catholics can't wear a cross, can't wear other symbols of their religious faith in public places. So public life is separate, private life is separate, and politics, the domain of politics, is away. But it is easier said than done when there are voters, when there is democratic elections, like divorce, issues like abortion, issues like same-sex marriages, and also the right to worship the way you want to worship is involved with human rights. So can you have a refugee population which may come from your old French territories like Algeria, which is Islamic, and say that they can't practice what their religion thinks is to be a core practice? So there is going to be this conflict between Christianity, human rights, Islam, fanaticism, Islamic terror, and also the Western concept of secularism and separation of state and religion, and the rights of refugees and human rights violations. So it is not just Turkey and France, it is once again making us think about these problems. We have to worry about these problems in our immediate neighborhood. In Pakistan, it might be not Islam and Christianity, but Islam and Buddhism in Sri Lanka. It might be Islam and Buddhism in Myanmar. It might be Islam and Islamic refugees of the Rakhine state in Bangladesh. Be very careful about how ethnicity, how religion, how sectarian interests clash, and these relate to international relations. How big powers try to exploit them. This is what is happening in Azerbaijan and Armenia. This might happen elsewhere. The newly installed Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Suga, has announced that he will do his first overseas trips to Vietnam and Indonesia. This is interesting because before that, the Japanese Prime Minister used to undertake his first overseas visit to United States of America, emphasizing the special bond of relationship which they had with America. But America under Trump has made it very clear that all its former allies have to shoulder the burden of their own defense, although there is a treaty of defense with Japan, which United States of America has, but it is difficult to imagine that the relationship would remain the same in future. So probably Suga is indicating and signaling to America that it also is weighing its options. These are not only strategic options, and these are also economic options, because foreign companies active in China are trying to move out of China due to instability, due to the hostility and enmity which America has vis-a-vis China, which is having a spillover effect for others, although China has tried to contain damage as much as it can. But some companies have moved to Thailand, some companies have moved to Singapore, some companies are planning to move to Taiwan. So why not Japan try to get some of these companies to move to Japan? That's one. And where, of course, these companies will not move to Japan because Japan is an expensive place to work, expensive labor, but it would be a very good opportunity for Japanese companies to get active in tripartite partnerships or work in a supply chain arrangement with Vietnam, with Indonesia, and so on. It is also interesting to note that because of the Indonesian territory in North Borneo, the South China Sea politics impinges on Indonesia very closely. Not as directly as it does on Malaysia, not as directly as it impinges on Vietnam and Philippines, but one step removed. And the Chinese nine-dash policy again treats the whole of South China Sea almost to the border of Indonesia as Chinese pond or a Chinese lake. So there is an economic aspect to it. There is also a strategic aspect to it. Now, one could even argue that Shinzo Abe, when he started his second term in office, for the first term of office he had gone to United States, but the second term of office he had come to Southeast Asia. So that is one part. The other interesting complexity in this situation is Chinese have been trying to extend their influence in a country like Cambodia, which had very close cultural ties with India at one stage during Prince Sihanouk's days, during the non-aligned movement, and centuries before that, the great temple of Angkor Wat and their culture. But all that is distant past. Chinese have promised so much infrastructural assistance to Cambodia. Some of their companies have performed badly there, buildings have collapsed, Cambodians and Chinese have died. But then there are ports like the Siem Reap port, where the satellite pictures have shown that the Cambodians are dismantling the US made naval facilities and making this available to the Chinese. So once the Chinese gain control of this port or have a military establishment, the whole geopolitical picture in Southeast Asia will change. So the Japanese Prime Minister perhaps is, with great foresight, trying to cultivate a relationship in Southeast Asia. 2-3 small hitches in this process. Some countries in Southeast Asia remember the days of exploitation during the Second World War, long time back. It is almost 75 years back, when Japanese forces occupied territories in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Malaysia, and in Indochina, and used forced labor to meet their war ends. But then, as they say, history is written by the victors. The Japanese unfortunately lost the war, so we do not know about the atrocities which the other colonial powers did in furthering their war efforts. So we have to forget about the period of co-prosperity sphere when the Japanese have made ample amends. They have apologized for whatever excesses were done there, etc. But they also, like self-respecting nations, honor their martyrs and dead and don't run them down. So Suga's trips to Southeast Asia allow us to rethink our relationship with Southeast Asia. All the time we talk in terms of India's soft power and this area where Indian cultural sphere is there, but let's separate the two. There are areas in Southeast Asia today where India traditionally had great cultural affinity, but those places like Cambodia or Laos next door, probably Indians do not have a position of advantage vis-a-vis the Chinese. We have been caught on the wrong foot. We have been caught napping. Similarly, in Myanmar, Burma, we have an ambivalence in policy, whether we support Aung San Suu Kyi or we support on humanitarian grounds the Rohingyas. What do we do with Rohingyas in Bangladesh, in our own country? This again creates problems for us. That leaves us with the countries like Malaysia, which have consistently had an anti-India stance since their Islamization of their public policy. Right now, the Prime Minister is caught in a huge financial scandal, but one of the large corporations there, which makes palm oil, and we in India think that we are the only ones who use palm oil, but palm oil is also used as lubricants, industrial lubricants, in toiletries, in soaps elsewhere also. This company was exploiting bonded labor. So violation of human rights, and many a time the people who are being used as bonded labor were people of Indian origin. So there is going to be a tension between India and Malaysia. Obviously, no great affinity between India and Cambodia and Laos. Philippines is much too far away, much too under the pressure of the Chinese. It is even disregarding the relationship with America to kowtow to China. That leaves for us only Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So, shall we not focus, like the Japanese Prime Minister, on cooperation with Vietnam and Indonesia on a priority basis? We then are going to cooperate with Japan in Quad in the Pacific Rim. So this would be a good option for Indian diplomacy in coming years. Another round of Sino-Indian border talks is over and no progress has been made. This was more or less expected, But what is causing concern is that China has introduced a very devious argument in this round of conversation. Chinese have made it clear that they will settle for nothing less than the 1959 border suggested by Zhou Enlai in his conversations with Nehru. And if this is accepted, which Nehru had rejected in 1959, it would amount to conceding China whatever it claims in Aksai Chin, in Arunachal, everywhere else. So China would be holding India to ransom by granting whatever they wish to grant, if at all. This had not been extended so far in the arguments, and I think we must also keep in mind that the negotiators keep changing, whether at different levels. Army commander, the corps commander on the spot has been changed. He presumably will now be a party to the commander level talks. He earlier has been there as a representative from the military headquarters. A joint secretary normally joins in. At a certain level, with the foreign secretaries level, foreign ministers level, talks have been held. I think all of this appears to be a very clever game on the part of the Chinese to buy respite, buy time, and to have the status quo legitimized not by the international community but effectively under their control. First, they persuaded Indians to say that, look, you withdraw some, we'll withdraw some. We will dismantle some of the permanent structures, you dismantle some of the permanent structures. But what they are doing effectively is they are doing what they want, and earlier there was an agreement between the two parties that no firearms would be used. But when these talks for de-escalation and normalization have been going on, there has been a heightening of tension. Firearms have been used, fired in the air at the moment, but any time an accidental conflagration can take place. No let-up is there on the build-up on either side in terms of missiles, in terms of helicopters, in terms of tanks and so on. So if you follow the media coverage either in India or in the state-controlled media in China, you would notice that we are almost in a low-intensity war, and national pride and jingoism is being injected into this relationship, where a diplomatic settlement becomes very difficult. We would like to suggest that India should not fall for the Chinese assurances every time the argument changes, every time the goalposts are shifted, and the Chinese cannot afford to go back home and say that Indians pushed back so hard that they could not annex the territories which they thought they would, like 1962. They are not referring to 1962 anymore. That they would say that it would be another lesson like 1962. They don't, because Indians reclaimed certain strategic heights in Pangong Tso. But this doesn't mean that the Indians can retain them all the time, or Indians can push back the Chinese all the way beyond the Tibetan territory. I think the great mistake made about losing the Tibet buffer was something which the Chinese has made use of. And how far do we make use of Tibet as a bargaining chip or as a strategic asset, or we use His Holiness the Dalai Lama's presence in India to put pressure on the international community, is another thing. But interestingly, the government of India is still fight shy of naming China. You know, there are indirect references that the Prime Minister in a speech mentioned Daulat Beg Oldi, which is in disputed territory, which is the highest airstrip in the world. You would say that the Rohtang Tunnel has been built, which cuts down the time of troop movement to 4 hours between Himachal Pradesh to Lahore, Spiti and beyond to Ladakh. But this is the kind of thing which created problems with Nepal. When you said that we have built a road which is strategically important to reach the Chinese border, the Nepalese, provoked by the Chinese presumably, took umbrage and started an anti-India stance. The Nepalese at the moment are having problems on their border with the Chinese occupation of their villages, but unfortunately the Indians are so focused on the military build-up in Kalwan Valley and the talks taking place here that they don't realize that China is in a position to exert and create trouble from Sikkim to Arunachal anytime. And then if they immobilize India on the land border in the Himalayan borderland, India's focus is shifted from South China Sea, it is shifted from Pacific, which we discussed a little earlier, and we do not evaluate properly the China's machinations in the immediate neighborhood in Turkey and Pakistan, where it can be encircling India at long last. I think the Indians should devote greater attention to immediate neighborhood. There was a visit by the Sri Lankan Prime Minister here. And again, I think the Indians should realize that the Chinese have gotten a toehold in Sri Lanka, and it will need great diplomatic and economic effort on our part to persuade the Sri Lankans to be more favorably inclined towards India and deny China what they have already leased out or granted. So, but as long as our Sri Lanka policy remains hostage to Tamil politics or the Tamil minorities, I don't think much progress can be made in that direction. Similarly, the disputes between Buddha, Ram continue in our relationship with Nepal. But as long as Mr. Oli is at the helm of the power, Indians cannot expect. Let the Nepalese decide who is a better friend for Nepal, either China and India, and wait for a while. We should also worry about Bangladesh, where the Chinese have been making great promises, and Saudis have been putting pressure on the Bangladeshis to grant passports to Rohingyas, who may become cheap labor for Saudi Arabia, and Bangladeshis are close to 140,000 repatriated from Saudi Arabia due to COVID crisis back to Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is worried whether these people will be allowed to go back to Saudi Arabia or not. So Bangladesh is having problems with flood, with climate change, with its economic problems, the retrenchment of textile factories, apparel factories. This is where I think India should focus on. And once India has set its neighborhood in order, especially with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, we are in a much better position to face China in any border. That is all we have for you this week. A few things remain to be said, but I think we better wait and watch for these developments. One is President Donald Trump in the middle of his presidential campaign testing positive for coronavirus, his campaign manager testing positive, his wife testing positive, and small mercies, the vice president is tested negative, and the Secretary of State has tested negative. But how this will affect his campaign is going to be an issue which everybody is going to speculate about. Some people say that why should we in India and students of international relations worry about American presidential elections, but America being a superpower, America being the largest economy in the world, the presidential elections and the outcome of the elections are bound to impact on every country in the world, big and small, near and far. So we will have to worry about this, but this coronavirus infection of the president, some people have come out of it, like Boris Johnson, like Bolsonaro, but we will have to wait and watch in the next 15 days what the impact of this is going to be, how Biden's election campaign is. Biden is tested negative, Kamala Harris is tested negative, so we'll wait and watch this campaign and talk to you about this a little later. Till next week, thank you and goodbye.